Hello again. In this video, we are going to jump right in and we're going to create our very first program in C Sharp. We're going to talk about the very basic parts of putting a C Sharp code file together and some of the very basic syntax, and we're going to create our very own program. Now, when you are creating a program in any language, you need to follow a certain process. First, you identify your inputs, process, and outputs of the program. Okay, so what information do you need to provide to your code? What is the process that your code should follow? So most of your code is this process. And then what are the outputs of your program? So, maybe if you're creating a program that adds numbers together, then your inputs would be the numbers that you are adding. The process would be telling the computer what to do with those numbers. And then the output would be your sum, the ending number that you want to get out from that program. Okay, the second part is designing the interface. We're going to be getting to that more starting in Chapter 3. For Chapters 1 and 2, we're really just going to be looking at text-based input and output, not a lot of graphical design, but we will get to that very soon. Third, identify the components and logic of the program. Okay, so once you know what the process is that the program needs to complete, you identify the smaller pieces and the logic of how you put that together. And a large part of this course discusses how you actually do that, how you complete step 3 of this process of identifying the components and logic. Fourth step, designing and developing the files and databases. We don't even really get into that much in this course. This course is mostly about steps 1, 2, and 3, and then, of course, 5, where you actually sit down and write and test the code. Okay, so the idea is you need to put together logically and conceptually how the program is supposed to work before you actually even write and test your code. So we're going to write our very first computer program, and the tradition in the programming world is to write a program called Hello World. The Hello World program is designed to say the words Hello World. It's the most basic program you can think of. Okay, so if we're following this 5-step process, step 1, identify the inputs, process, and outputs of the program. The inputs are none. It doesn't require the user to do anything. The process is that it tells the computer how to say hello to you. And then it has one single output, which is the words hello world. All right, in this case, our interface is going to be very simple. It's just going to be text. Step 3, identify the components and logic of the program. Not very complex logic. We're just telling the computer to spit out a couple of words. There's no associated files or databases with it. And so now we're to step 5. Let's write and test our code. So if you open up Notepad or another text editing software, we are going to write our very first piece of programming code. All right. So once you have Notepad open, type the word class, add a space, and we're going to call it first class. Now, anytime that you write a piece of C# code, you have to name that code as a class and give it a name. So you'll type the word class and then you'll give it a name. We're just going to call it first class because this is the first class that we are creating as novice C# programmers. But you could name this anything that you want, really. All right, we're going to hit enter. And on the next line, we're going to use curly brackets. In C Sharp, as well as many other languages, we use the curly brackets to group different statements of code. All right, so all of our code is going to go inside of these brackets. Now, inside of these brackets, we're going to type the words static void main with a capital M, and then we're going to have an opening parenthesis and a closing parenthesis. Now, when we get to some of the later chapters, I'll explain more specifically why you type these specific words and what it means when we say static and void and main. But for now, I just want you to know that every application that is programmed in C# has what we call a main method, and it has the word static void main followed by another set of curly brackets. And I'll indent that so you can see, okay, these are the brackets that group together our class, okay? And then these are the brackets that group together what we call our main method. Every C# application has a main method, and a method is a group of instructions. So inside of these curly braces, we can put our instructions for the program. Here we are going to type the words system with a capital S, and then period, and then the word console with a capital C, period, and then the word write with a capital W, line with a capital L, then parentheses, and inside those parentheses, we're going to type inside quotations, hello world. And at the end, we're going to type a semicolon. Okay, so you've just typed and created your very first C# program. Congratulations. Now let me explain a little bit more about what is going on in this programming code. Okay, so we've got a class which is a group of methods and statements. Usually one class corresponds to one file. So we've got this file that we're creating in Notepad, and we're giving it the name of first class. Okay. Within that class, we can include statements and methods are groups of statements. Every method has a name. The name of this method is main. So when you have a method, you have the name of the method followed by some parentheses, followed by some curly braces. And then you have inside those curly braces a set of statements. So this is an example of a program statement. So this is one instruction for the computer. And the instruction that we are giving the computer is to write the line, hello world. Okay. So just like main is a method, WriteLine is also a method. Anytime you see a word that has parentheses after it, you can consider that to be a method. Okay. Sometimes we have inputs inside of the parentheses. So the WriteLine method takes one input, which is a set of text, and we put that inside of the parentheses. Okay. So system.console.WriteLine is a method that we have called or invoked, is the language that we use. And the input that we have given that method is this text. This is what we call a literal string. In programming, a string is a piece of text, and a literal string is text that we have specifically provided. So hello world are two very specific words that we chose, and we put them inside of double quotation marks, and this is what we call a literal string. And the last thing I want to point out here in our code is a semicolon. So every statement in C# and similar object-oriented programming languages ends with a semicolon. All right. So to sum that up in a different way, our program file has a set of statements, such as this one. This statement, we are telling the computer to write a line of text. Every statement ends with a semicolon. Statements can include methods. They can include other things that we'll see in other examples. But this statement calls a method known as the system.console.writeLine method. What that method does is it takes the string that we input inside the parentheses, and the computer spits out, so to speak, spits out that string. Okay, so we've got a program statement that ends in a semicolon. That statement is included inside of our main method. So you can write different types of methods as you're programming and give them all sorts of different names. The name of this method is main. It is the main method, and every single C# program has to have a main method. So for the first several modules that we complete, whenever we write a program, we are going to start the same way by writing the word static void main parentheses, and then including our statements inside the curly braces following the word main, opening parenthesis, closing parenthesis. So this is our main method. As I said, for most of the programs, your main method and the statements or instructions inside of the main method will be pretty much the bulk of the program for the first several examples that we do. Okay. And your main method, as well as whatever methods or statements you include in your program, is inside of the curly braces following the word class and the name that we gave that class. So in this program, we've used several keywords that have to be very specific. We've used the keyword class. We've used the keywords static, void, and we've used the keywords system.console.writeLine. These all have very specific meanings in C#, and we type them exactly, including the capitalization. Okay. If we had put a lowercase w here, the C# compiler would not know what we're talking about. This would be total nonsense. Okay? Even though we can kind of interpret it in English to mean the same thing, the computer is very exact and will not know what that means. Okay? So when you're using specific methods and specific keywords, you have to be exact, 100% exact in your spelling and your capitalization. Okay? If we hadn't capitalized this, our program wouldn't work. If we forgot our semicolon, this program's not going to work. Okay? If we forgot our closing curly brace, this program is not going to work. Okay? These are the syntax rules that you have to follow in order for a C# program to work. Now, even though we've had very specific keywords that we use, there are also some other words that are not as exact. Okay? The name of our class, we could have used any word at all that we wanted to here. Okay? The string that we input to our WriteLine method, we could put anything we want there. Okay? So you'll see in some cases you have to be very specific and call certain keywords that C# understands. And then in other cases, you provide the names for the class, for your inputs, and so forth. Okay, so now we've created this piece of code. Let me jump back to the PowerPoint slide. Okay, I'm going to come back and talk about namespaces actually in a different video. But you'll see here I've got the C# method parts. So every method has a header, which includes the method name and information about what will pass into and be returned from a method. So in our case, our main method has a header. This is the header, which is the name and some other information. Okay. And then it has a method body, which is contained inside the curly braces and includes the instructions that are executed by the method. All right, a few other things. So Whitespace can be anything that is between words. So whether it's a space, a tab, an enter, carriage return, a blank line, all of that is what we call white space. So we use white space to organize our code and make it easier to read. So in our example of our Hello World program, we've used some space here to make it easier to read. You'll see that everything inside of these outside curly braces I indented or actually put 3 spaces. You could use the tab, you can use indents, I used spaces here. Okay, I added some space here. So all of that white space, this white space that I used, it didn't have to be that exact number of spaces. Okay, C# will just ignore any white space, spaces, tabs, new lines. Okay, I could write this, if I had this all on the same line, like this, that would be harder for us to read and understand, but C# compiler would interpret it exactly the same. Okay. So it's good to use white space so that when you are looking at your programming code your programming code later, you can remember and understand why you typed things up the way that you did. Okay, casing. Camel casing is typically used for variables, and we're going to be talking about variables in Chapter 2. Camel casing is when you squish words together into one word, and you don't capitalize the first word, but you capitalize all the other words. Okay? So we haven't used any camel casing in our first program, in our Hello World program, but I'll just down here show you. So if we wanted to call a variable new number. This is an example of camel casing. We put it all into one word, and we capitalize every word except for the first one. Pascal casing, on the other hand, is when you squish words together into one word and you capitalize each of the words within that squished up word. So Pascal casing we typically use for methods and method names and class names. So here, when we named our class first class, we used Pascal casing because we capitalized the F and we capitalized the C. And main, we capitalized the M. Okay? So usually when you are naming a method or a class, you get to come up with the name, with the single exception being the main method always is called main. But the protocol usually is to use Pascal casing. Then when we're naming variables, which we'll talk about in Chapter 2, you use camel casing, which is almost the same, except that you don't capitalize at the very beginning. All right, now if you're following along, and you typed in his example of camel casing. This was just an example to show you the casing. This does nothing. This makes no sense. You want to delete this before we try and run this program, or the computer won't recognize it. Okay, I've already talked about the information on this screen. Mostly, C# has certain keywords, special words that are reserved that have special meaning. So for example, the word class has a certain meaning. That's a C# keyword. The name of the method that we wrote is main, and every application must have a main method. Classes that have a main method in the class are called application classes, and others are called non-application classes. So the hello world program that we wrote is an application class because it has the main method in it. But as you start writing more and more complex programs, you might have one class or file that has a main method in it, which is grouped with other classes that don't have a main method, and you combine those all together to create an application. Within this course, we're going to be sticking with simple classes. We're going to say main method most of the time. Okay. And the keyword void, we'll come back to that in another chapter. You don't have to understand that right at this moment. Okay, when you are selecting an identifier, when you are naming something in your code, such as when we named our class first class, there are specific rules that you have to follow. When you're coming up with a name for a class or a method or a variable, that name must begin with a letter or an @ or an underscore. It can't start with a number. It can't start with any other special characters. And it can only contain letters, numbers, underscores, and the @ and no other special characters. And it can't be a C# reserved keyword. Here are some C# reserved keywords. Several of these we will learn about during this course. We'll understand what they are used for. I'm bringing them up here, and you can refer to these in the PowerPoint slide that I'm giving you that accompanies this video, just so you know that you can't name any of your classes or your methods or your variables as these specific words, because these are reserved keywords that have special meaning in C#. Okay, so here's some examples of identifiers that you might use. Employee, first class, like we used in our Hello World program, push button control, budget 2016. These are all valid names that you could come up with for a class. They follow the rules. They contain only letters and numbers. They start with a letter and not a number. All good. All right. This table 1.3 shows some examples of legal class names in C#. So you could choose to use these. These are all legal. They use underscores, letters, and numbers, but it's not really conventional because it's normal to use Pascal casing, as I mentioned, where you squish the words together without underscores and you capitalize the first letter of each word. Okay. Employee is not a conventional class name because it's not capitalized. First class is unconventional because it has an underscore, which is legal, but it's not common. Push button control is not conventional because you haven't capitalized the B and the C. All caps is not really a traditional way to name things. And void is a name that you cannot use because it is a reserved C# keyword. Now down here you have examples of identifiers that you cannot use at all. These are what we call illegal. You cannot name a class any of these things. For example, they have spaces in them. They are reserved keywords. They have special characters or they start with a number. All right, so those are some of the basic rules. Now, once you've written out your program, the next step is to compile that program um, into something that the computer will understand. So what generally happens is you compile your source code. The source code is the code that we wrote. That gets compiled into what's called intermediate language. Now in C Sharp, when we compile our program, it actually does two steps at once. It takes the source code and puts it into intermediate language, and then it also translates that intermediate language into an executable statement that we can run. Now, there's two ways to compile a C# program. One of those I will show you in just a minute using what we call the command line. And the other is in the Integrated Development Environment, or IDE, which basically means in the Visual Studio application. And I will show you how to do that once we get to using Visual Studio starting in Chapter 3. But for now, we are going to be compiling our program using the command line. So if you open up your Start menu and you type in the words Developer Command Prompt, and you should be able to open a program that looks like this. Okay. We're going to use the developer command prompt to compile and run the program that we wrote. Now, before we get to that, let's jump back to our notepad file or whatever you used to write this program. Now, I will note that you can use any simple text-based editor such as Notepad or Notepad++. You cannot use Microsoft Word to type up your program code, okay? Because Microsoft Word adds a bunch of other stuff to your code, and you won't be able to compile a Microsoft Word document into a C# program. So make sure you're using Notepad or something very simple. Okay, once we have typed up all of our code and we're ready to go, we think all of our syntax and everything is correct, we're going to save that code as a file. And it's very important that you know where on your computer you're saving this code. Maybe you have, it would be probably a good idea to have a specific folder set aside for your programming code. So I'm just going to put mine on the desktop. I'm going to create a folder called Chapter 1 Code. And inside of that code, I'm going to save this file. Now, by default, Notepad will want you to save this file as a .txt or a text document. We do not want to do that. So if you're using Notepad, make sure down here under Save As Type, you select All Files. And then we're going to name our file. We can name it whatever we want, but the convention is typically to name your file the same thing that you named your class. So when we typed up our programming code, we gave our class the name First Class. So I'm also going to name my file First Class. And it's very, very important that you put the right extension on the end. So whatever you name it, First Class or whatever else you're going to name it, at the end you type a period and then the word CS. So all of our code gets saved in a .cs file. I'm going to click Save. Okay, so now we have a .cs file, but that doesn't really do anything. You can't run that program. You can just open it up and edit it, but you can't actually run it. So now what we're going to do is we are going to jump back to our developer command prompt. We're going to use our developer command prompt to compile our program. Now here I'm going to give you a few hints that should be useful to you. The first step in compiling is we have to navigate to the folder where our .cs file is stored. Okay? So you'll see that by default, the command prompt opened to this folder with the path name of C:\users /Jordan /source. Okay. That's not where I've saved my code. So I need to type cd, that stands for change directory, cd space, and then the name of the path where your C# programming file is saved. So in my case, it's saved in C, and you can either type this manually, like this, users, Jordan, desktop, and what did I name that folder? Chapter 1 code. Okay, so there I've manually typed in the path where I've saved my code. If you don't want to type that in manually, what you can do is type cd space, and then you can copy and paste the location of that folder. So for example, if you open up that folder in Windows Explorer, and then you click up here in the address bar, it will highlight the path, which is the location on the computer where that folder is. You can right-click that and select copy. And then in the developer command prompt, if you right-click and choose paste, then it will paste that path for you. Okay, very important that you are navigating to the correct path, the correct folder on your computer where your code is stored. Okay, now to actually compile that programming code into an executable application, you type the word CSC, which stands for C# compiler, then a space, and then you type the name of the file. So we named our file firstclass.cs. So we navigated to the right folder, and then we type CSC space, and then the name of our C# code file. Hit enter. And it will give you some copyright info, and that's it. Okay, so if it looks like it didn't do anything, that's actually great news. That means that your program compiled correctly. Then if you go back to the folder where your code is stored, you'll see that the computer created a new file. So the firstclass.cs file is the file that we created. And the computer the compiler has just created this executable file called firstclass.exe. Now, if we want to run that file, you can try and double click it, but you probably won't see anything on your screen. It'll look like nothing happened. If you go back to your developer command prompt and type the name of that file, which is firstclass.exe, then the computer tells you, hello world. So our program worked. Another shortcut is when you are trying to run a .exe file, which is an executable file. Typing the .exe is optional. You could also just type first class and your program will run. So you've created your very first software application that tells you the words hello world in the developer command prompt. Congratulations!